My son said, "The best gift would be for you to die, Mom." So I was cleaning the living room when I heard the words no mother should ever hear. My 23-year-old son looked me in the eye. With that face I myself brought into this world, and said, "The greatest gift would be for you to die." Mom, you know that feeling when the ground drops out from under you. That's exactly what I felt in that moment. My heart stopped, my breath caught, and all I could think was, how did we get here? How did the baby I first held in my arms in the Seattle hospital turn into this hateful stranger? I stood there, clutching the cleaning cloth, trying to process if this was real or if I was having a horrible nightmare. But it wasn't a nightmare. It was my life, and I needed to understand what had happened to my family. Let me go back in time a bit so you can understand how everything started to fall apart. My name is Claire. I'm 52 years old, and for a long time, I believed I'd done everything right as a mother. I lived in Portland, Oregon, in a modest but comfortable house that my late husband, Robert, and I bought when our son Thomas was just 3 years old. The house was in Alberta, a neighborhood that was then emerging, full of young families like us, with those tree-lined streets typical of the Pacific Northwest. Robert was a civil engineer working on major infrastructure projects around the city, and I was an elementary school teacher at Sabin Elementary. We weren't rich, far from it, but we never lacked for anything at home. Thomas had a good childhood, you know. He played baseball on the school team, had friends who came home to play video games in the basement, and got decent grades. He was a normal kid, or at least that's what I thought at the time. When I looked at him with that blind pride only mothers have, when Robert died 6 years ago in a car accident on Interstate 5 during a terrible winter storm, my life was turned upside down. Thomas was 17, a senior at Grant High School. It was such a shock, so sudden. Robert had left for work that morning, kissed me goodbye in the kitchen like he did every day, and never returned. The call came at 2 in the afternoon, a state trooper, his voice formal and distant, telling me there had been an accident, that they needed someone to identify the body. I remember falling to the kitchen floor, the phone slipping from my hand, and Thomas finding me there, crying uncontrollably, unable to form the words to explain what had happened. It was hard for all of us, but especially for him. Robert was that kind of truly present father. You know, not just physically, but emotionally too. He went to all of Thomas's baseball games, no matter how tired he was from work. He helped with his math and physics homework at the kitchen table every night. He taught Thomas how to change the car's oil on the weekends, how to fix a leaky faucet, how to use tools from the toolbox in the garage. They had a special connection, that father-son bond that seemed unbreakable. They watched Portland Trail Blazers games together on weekends, went fishing on the Columbia River in the summer, and when Robert was gone, it was as if half of Thomas's identity disappeared too. I saw my son change drastically. It was as if a light had gone out inside him, leaving only shadows where there had once been a glow. He became quieter, more distant, more withdrawn. I tried to fill that void. I swear I tried with all my might. But how do you replace a father? How can a mother also be a father? I didn't know. Nobody taught me that. I remember the funeral as if it were yesterday, every detail etched indelibly in my memory. The rain fell hard on that gray October morning, typical of Portland, the kind of rain that seems to cry along with you. The cemetery was in Riverview, surrounded by tall pines that dripped endlessly. Thomas stood beside me, wearing the only suit he owned, the one Robert had bought him just 2 months earlier for a family wedding, staring at the mahogany casket with a completely blank expression that broke my heart. He didn't cry during the entire ceremony, not a single tear. People commented, whispering with that tone of pity I hated, "Poor thing, he's in shock." I held his hand, but it was like holding a hand of stone, cold and unresponsive. I thought it was just shock, that eventually he would process the pain and we could lean on each other, become closer through our shared tragedy. But now, looking back with the terrible clarity that only time brings, I realized that it was there that something fundamental broke inside him. It was there that the anger began to grow, silent and poisonous, like mold on the walls that you don't see until it's too late, until it's already contaminated everything. The following years were complicated in ways I hadn't expected. Thomas went to Portland State University to study business, but he seemed to just go with the flow, without any real passion or clear direction. He chose the major because he could work anywhere, not because he loved it. He still lived with me, which I thought was good at the time because it allowed me to keep an eye on him, make sure he was eating right, studying, and not losing himself in grief. But the truth is, We had practically become strangers living in the same house. He spent hours and hours locked in his room, on the computer, doing God knows what, only leaving to go to the bathroom or grab a quick bite to eat in the kitchen. When I tried to talk, he responded with monosyllables or grunts. "How was class today?" "Good. Want to have dinner with me? I made that chicken you like." "Whatever. Do you need anything?" "No." It was like talking to a brick wall. I tried to force conversation during dinner, but he ate quickly and went back upstairs, leaving me alone at the table that used to be so full of laughter when Robert was alive. I tried everything to reconnect, to find some way into that closed-off world he'd created. I'd suggest special dinners at his favorite restaurants, that artisanal burger joint in Hawthorne he'd loved when he was younger. I'd suggest weekend plans, like going to the Saturday market downtown, things we'd do when we were kids. I'd try to watch his favorite shows on Netflix, even though I didn't understand half the references. But it was always the same, complete disinterest, blank stares, monosyllabic answers. Sometimes I'd stay up late, lying in the darkness of my room, listening to him moving around in the next room, heavy footsteps, low music, the constant sound of his keyboard typing, and I'd wonder if I was doing something wrong, if I should give him more space or be more present, if I should be stricter or more understanding. It's funny and sad how we automatically blame ourselves when things don't go well with our children, as if every problem were a direct and shameful reflection of our competence as parents, as if there was some perfect formula that I simply hadn't been able to discover. I didn't know it at the time, but Thomas was harboring a deep, corrosive resentment. It wasn't just his father's death, though that was the initial trigger. It was everything, for the life he felt he should have had but didn't. For his high school friends who went to better colleges like Stanford or UC Berkeley with full scholarships and brilliant projects. For his girlfriend, Jessica, who broke up with him during his sophomore year because she wasn't feeling the same way anymore, leaving him devastated for months. For the feeling of being stuck, stagnant, while everyone around him seemed to be moving forward quickly in their professional and personal lives. And somehow, in his distorted and increasingly toxic mental process, all of this was my fault. I represented everything that was wrong with his life. I was the convenient scapegoat for all his failures and frustrations. There was an incident during his junior year of college that should have been a giant red flag. The kind you can't ignore. Thomas had applied for a competitive internship at a tech company in Seattle, Amazon, one of the biggest in the industry. He was so excited about the possibility, he talked about it for weeks nonstop. It was the first time in years I'd seen genuine enthusiasm and hope in him. He was studying for the interview, practicing technical questions, buying new clothes with the little money he had. He said this would change everything, that he'd finally have a chance to get out of Portland, to do something meaningful. It was like seeing a glimpse of the kid he used to be. But he didn't get the internship. They chose another candidate, probably someone from a more prestigious university. When he got the rejection email one Tuesday afternoon, I was in the kitchen preparing dinner, making a stew that had always comforted him as a child. I heard a scream coming from his room. Then the loud sound of something violently breaking, glass shattering. My heart raced, and I ran up the stairs, nearly tripping on the steps. The room was a complete and terrifying mess. He'd thrown the laptop against the wall so hard, it left a dent in the paint. The screen was completely cracked, bits of plastic scattered about. Books that had once been neatly arranged on the bookshelf were now scattered across the floor, some with pages ripped out. The chair had overturned, and Thomas stood there, in the middle of it all, at the epicenter of the destruction. His hands gripping his hair so tightly, he seemed to want to rip it out, breathing heavily like a wounded animal. "Thomas, my God, what happened?" I asked, genuinely frightened. I'd never seen him so out of control. He looked at me, and there was something in his eyes that made me instinctively take a step back. Pure rage. They didn't choose me. Of course they didn't choose me. Why the hell would they choose someone who came from a mediocre college, a mediocre family, a completely mediocre and purposeless life? I tried to console him, approaching slowly, as if I were dealing with something that could explode at any moment. "Son, listen, one rejection doesn't define you at all. You'll have other opportunities, other companies, other internships. This is just a temporary setback." But my words, instead of calming him, seemed to plunge him even deeper into rage. He exploded completely. "You don't understand anything. Absolutely nothing. You with your secure teaching job, your guaranteed retirement from the school district, your small, protected world. You don't know what it's like to have to compete in this brutal world out there. Everything is about connections, about networking, about where you came from, about how much money your parents have to give you advantages. And we have none of that. Nothing. Each word was like a slap in the face. I stood there, paralyzed, not knowing what to say. Thomas, your father and I always did the best we could. You had food, shelter, education, love, support. He laughed, but it was a bitter, cruel laugh, devoid of humor. Love doesn't pay bills, Mom. Love doesn't get you internships. Love doesn't get you into Stanford. After graduating with mediocre grades and no honors, Thomas got a job working at an insurance company's call center in Beaverton. It wasn't what he wanted, obviously. It wasn't what any young college graduate wants. He had big dreams of working at a groundbreaking tech startup in Silicon Valley or Seattle, making a killing doing something revolutionary, living in one of those modern Pearl District lofts featured in design magazines. But the reality was a cramped cubicle, uncomfortable headphones, angry clients complaining about policies, and a salary of $3,000 a month. It was barely enough to pay basic bills in Portland, much less have the life he dreamed of. He began making bitter comments about money every chance he got. If we had a better house in a better neighborhood, I could have gone to a better college. If you had made Robert see a doctor sooner, maybe they would have detected something. He would still be alive, and I wouldn't be in this shitty situation. Every sentence was like a knife to the heart. But I swallowed the pain, swallowed the tears. I thought it was just a difficult phase of adjusting to adulthood, that he was processing the pain of grief in his own way, that he would eventually mature and see that life wasn't as simple as it seemed. There were days when I'd catch myself staring at him over breakfast, this young man who was my son but seemed like a complete stranger, and wonder, where did I lose you? At what exact moment did you decide I was the enemy? I relived memories of his childhood obsessively, searching for clues I'd missed. Was it when I refused to let him go to that summer camp at 12 because I thought he was too young and inexperienced? When I changed schools in 6th grade because we were moving to a bigger house? When I chose to keep working instead of being a full-time mom like some other mothers did? When I was too strict with grades or too lax with discipline? Every decision I made as a mother was now questioned, dissected, analyzed, searching for the precise moment when everything went wrong, the turning point that turned my loving son into an angry stranger. What I didn't realize, what I was completely blind to, was that Thomas was actively blaming me for all his failures and frustrations. In his increasingly distorted mind, I was directly responsible for everything that had gone wrong in his life. And worse, he began to see me and the house as real, physical obstacles to his future happiness. He began to coldly calculate, how much was the house worth in the current Portland real estate market? How much would he receive if I died? The life insurance Robert had left was already exhausted, spent on the funeral, past due bills, and his college tuition. But the house was worth nearly $450,000. According to the Zillow estimates he obsessively checked, and in his distorted and increasingly sociopathic mind, that was the magic solution to all his problems. With that money, he could finally have the life he thought he deserved. I started noticing strange little things around the house that made me uneasy. My documents were being moved around. My laptop was in slightly different positions than I usually left it. Once, I found my birth certificate out of the locked drawer where I always kept it, on my office desk, as if someone had photocopied it and put it back in a hurry. When I asked Thomas if he'd touched my documents, he said no so matter-of-factly, looking me straight in the eye, that I almost believed him. But I knew it was a lie. He was investigating, cataloging, preparing something. For what exactly? I still wasn't sure. But a deep sense of unease began to grow deep in my stomach. That feminine intuition we sometimes ignore but are rarely wrong. Things started to get really strange and disturbing. About 6 months before that fateful day, Thomas began asking questions about my health with unusual frequency. Have you been seeing the doctor regularly? Mom, is your cholesterol high? I saw you're taking blood pressure medication. Is this serious? Do you have a family history of heart disease? At first, naive as I was, I thought he was finally showing genuine concern for me. that he was maturing and realizing I wasn't going to be around forever, that he was finally showing some filial care. What an idiot I was. He wasn't concerned. He was assessing, calculating my life expectancy like a cold actuary doing insurance calculations. How much longer would he have to wait patiently for nature to do its work? And if it was too long, how could he speed up the process? There was a particularly disturbing conversation during a quiet dinner. We'd ordered Chinese food from the local restaurant, one of the few things we still did together occasionally, a tradition that had survived since he was a child. Thomas was quiet, poking at his chow mein with his fork without actually eating, when he suddenly asked, "Mom, have you ever seriously thought about what happens after you die?" I nearly choked on my spring roll. What kind of question is that? My heart started beating faster. He shrugged, feigning casualness, but there was something calculated in his tone. "I don't know. Just normal curiosity. Like, do you have an updated will? Life insurance yet? Funeral plans? Those things responsible adults have to think about." My mouth went dry. "Why are you asking this now?" "Relax, Mom. There's no need to get defensive. It's just that you're getting older. 52 isn't that young anymore. We need to be practical and think about these things in advance." He was 23 years old and was talking about my death as if it were inevitable and imminent. As if I were 1 foot in the grave. I was 52, not 80. Women my age easily live another 30 or 40 years. There was one particular night that should have prompted me to act immediately, but I was still in denial. I woke up thirsty around 3 in the morning, the dry thirst of someone who'd had wine with dinner, and when I quietly went down to the kitchen, I caught Thomas rummaging through my medicines in the cabinet. He went completely white when he saw me standing there in the doorway, stammering something incoherent about looking for aspirin because he had a headache. But I clearly saw the small bottle of thyroid medication in his hand, that distinctive orange prescription bottle. My heart raced, but I refused to believe what my intuition was screaming louder and louder. "Thomas, what are you doing with my medicine?" He mumbled something incomprehensible about having grabbed the wrong bottle in the dark and ran to his room, like a child caught doing something wrong. I stood there in the kitchen, shaking from hand to foot, desperately trying to convince myself that I was being paranoid, that I was seeing things where there weren't any. But a seed of genuine fear had been planted deep down, and it was quickly beginning to germinate. The next day, I waited for him to leave for work and meticulously counted the pills in the bottle he'd been holding. I was missing 3. I knew exactly how many I should have because I'd just picked up my new prescription at Walgreens just 4 days earlier and had been taking one a day religiously every morning. 3 pills had mysteriously disappeared. I seriously considered confronting him when I got home. But what exactly would I say? "You stole my thyroid pills. To do what with them?" The questions sounded absurd even in my own head, but curiosity and fear led me to research online about the effects of high doses of levothyroxine. What I read chilled me to the bone. Excessive doses could cause serious heart problems, severe palpitations, arrhythmia, and even fatal heart attack in extreme cases, especially when mixed with other substances. My blood literally ran cold, but still, a stubborn part of me categorically refused to believe that my son, my own son who came out of my body, could be planning something as horrible and unthinkable as killing me. After that terrifying incident, I began paying obsessive attention to everything. And the more I observed with my eyes finally open, the more strange and terrifying things I noticed. My food sometimes tasted different, slightly bitter or chemical, especially when Thomas insisted on cooking dinner, which had started happening with suspicious frequency in the last few weeks. He, who had never cooked in his life, suddenly wanted to make me dinner. I felt strangely drowsy and disoriented after certain dinners Thomas prepared so carefully. My vitamin pills and supplements seemed to be disappearing faster than they should, the bottles emptying in half the normal time. I began experiencing unexplained dizziness during the day. Moments when the room would spin, and I needed to hold on to something. Random heart palpitations that left me breathless. Nausea, for no apparent reason. My family doctor, Dr. Harrison, couldn't find anything wrong with my blood tests and regular checkups. But I knew deep down that something was definitely going on with my body. I just didn't want to consciously accept what I really was. I began running discrete tests to confirm my growing suspicions. He would leave food Thomas had prepared aside, pretending he'd eaten it while secretly throwing it away. On the days he did this, he didn't experience any dizziness or unusual symptoms. I took my vitamins and supplements directly from the freshly opened bottle, not leaving them in the kitchen where he could easily access them overnight. I bought a small, discreet safe for my bedroom and began storing all my prescription medications there, locked with a code only I knew. And do you know what happened that was telling? The symptoms stopped completely and immediately. No dizziness, no nausea, no palpitations, which undeniably confirmed my worst fears. My son was systematically poisoning me, slowly, patiently, methodically, trying to make it appear as if it were natural causes, an age-related decline, perhaps a stroke or heart attack that no one would question in a woman in her 50s. The final straw that completely broke my denial came on a sunny Sunday afternoon. I had just returned from churches. I still went religiously to Grace Community Church every week. It was my only real moment of peace and spiritual connection, and Thomas was in the living room with a laptop open, so absorbed he hadn't even heard me come in. As I casually passed behind him on my way to the kitchen, I saw clearly on the screen that he was researching inheritances in Oregon, wills, estate processing times, estate taxes, how to contest wills, and lawyers specializing in family disputes. My blood instantly froze. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. He slammed the laptop shut as soon as he noticed me, but it was too late. I had seen everything clearly, and in that moment of painful crystal clear clarity, everything finally made perfect sense. The persistent questions about my health, the sudden, uncharacteristic interest in cooking dinner, the disappearing medications, the computer searches about my death and its financial consequences. My own son was actively planning my death so he could inherit the house, and what little I had. I went straight to my room that afternoon and locked the door with hands that shook uncontrollably. I sat on the edge of the bed, hugging a pillow to my chest, trying to control my breathing, which came in short, rapid gasps. Pure panic. It was pure, absolute panic coursing through my veins, like poison. I grabbed my cell phone, my fingers trembling over the numbers 911. I almost dialed 911, but stopped at the last second. What exactly would I tell the operator? My son is researching inheritances online. That wasn't a crime. Do I think he's slowly poisoning me? But I had no concrete, court-admissible evidence. I'd thrown out all the suspicious food weeks ago. I hadn't saved any samples. I hadn't gone to the hospital for detailed toxicology tests when I was feeling ill. It was literally my word against his. And what son wouldn't seem more credible than a possibly paranoid mother entering old age? I slept absolutely nothing that terrible night. I lay completely still in the pitch-black darkness of my room, staring at the unseen ceiling, listening to every noise in the house, every creak of wood, every sound that could have been footsteps approaching my door. I tried to process the sheer, terrifying magnitude of what was happening. How does a mother emotionally cope with the discovery that her son wants her dead, that he's actively working to make that happen? What kind of thoughts run through your head when you realize that the person you loved most in the entire world sees you only as a financial obstacle? I obsessively questioned whether I had been a terrible, failed mother, if I had messed up so completely and fundamentally that I had created a mindless monster. I replayed every memory of his childhood, every decision I made in raising him, every significant moment. Where exactly had I gone so catastrophically wrong? The next morning, exhausted and with dark circles under my eyes, I decided to confront him directly, but not in the way you probably imagine. I didn't arrive violently accusing him or screaming hysterically. I sat calmly with him at the breakfast table and tried to have an honest, open-hearted conversation, perhaps for the last time. Thomas, we really need to talk about what's going on between us, about this growing tension. He didn't even look up from his phone screen, where he was scrolling through his endless social media feed. Nothing special is going on. Son, please look at me when I'm talking. I can clearly sense that you resent me, that you deeply blame me for things that aren't going well in your life. He finally lifted his head and looked at me, and what I saw in those eyes scared me to the core. It wasn't sadness or understandable frustration. It was pure, distilled, concentrated hatred. There wasn't a spark of love there, not a microscopic shred of affection or recognition of who I was to him. I was just a problem to be solved. You don't understand anything about anything, Mom. He spat the words out like poison burning his mouth. You live in this protected bubble, this fantasy where you think you did everything right, that you were the perfect mother. But the truth is, you completely ruined my life from the start. I felt my heart physically tighten in my chest. What do you mean, Thomas? What specifically did I do that was so terrible? Please explain it to me so I can understand. He began listing methodically, as if he had a mental checklist he reviewed frequently. You chose the wrong public school for me, when you could have put me in a better private school. You didn't have enough money for a really good college, so I had to go to You wouldn't let me live in a dorm when I had the chance to gain social experience. You were suffocatingly overprotective throughout my adolescence. You spoiled me too much when I was a child, so I didn't learn to fight. You were too harsh when I needed understanding and emotional support. It was one complete contradiction after another. Absolutely nothing I had done was right in his eyes. I was simultaneously guilty of everything and its exact opposite. There was no coherent logic whatsoever. Just blind rage, desperately looking for targets to attack. And then he said something that left me completely floored, breathless. Do you have any idea how much this house is worth on the current market? How much could I make with all that money if I weren't stuck here? He leaned forward, eyes shining with a sickening intensity. I could finally start my real life, quit this crappy, humiliating job, invest in my own business, open that game store I've always wanted, travel to Europe, Japan, see the world, have a life worth living. But no, I have to stay here, completely trapped, wasting my youth, taking care of you, taking care of me. He barely spoke to me. He'd go days without saying good morning. Thomas, no one is asking you for anything at all to stay here. You're an adult, 23 years old. You can leave whenever you want, rent an apartment, start your own independent life away from me. He laughed loudly, but it was humorless, almost maniacal. With a paltry $3,000 a month in Portland, are you completely insane or out of touch with reality? You have no idea how the real world works out there. Decent apartments cost $1,500, $2,000. Then there's food, transportation, insurance, internet all expensive. There's nothing left. You don't understand that I need real capital to start something. And it's your fault for not giving me the right financial tools to succeed. I tried desperately to reason with him, to find some kind of human connection. Thomas, your father and I always did the absolute best we could with the resources we had. You had quality food every day, a comfortable and safe home, a complete education, health insurance, unconditional love, constant emotional support. What more did you want from us? We weren't rich, but we gave you everything that mattered. He slammed his hand hard on the wooden table, making the coffee cups jump and the liquid splash. I wished I wasn't mediocre. I wished I had the same real opportunities others had. I wished I had been born into a family that could actually give me a real life, not this pathetic, hopeless, lower middle class, broke existence. His words were like repeated stabs in the same place. Lower middle class, broke. We had worked so incredibly hard for decades to give him a stable and comfortable life. Robert had worked countless hours of overtime. I had tutored nights and weekends to supplement our income. And now he was throwing all of this back in our faces, as if it were absolutely worthless, as if we had failed miserably as parents. It was after this devastating conversation that things quickly escalated into even more dangerous territory. Thomas completely stopped pretending or keeping up appearances. He began to be openly and deliberately hostile about everything. He purposely left the kitchen a disgusting mess, dishes piled up in the sink for days, spoiled food left out, flies starting to appear. He didn't help with anything around the house, not even taking out the trash anymore. He completely stopped paying the small monthly contribution he made for groceries and bills. He brought home weird, creepy friends who gave me strange and intimidating looks. They were guys I'd never seen before in his life, with excessive facial piercings, tattoos stretching up their necks, dirty clothes, and that characteristic smell of someone who doesn't take care of themselves. They smoked something in the garage that clearly wasn't normal cigarettes, and laughed loudly and aggressively in the wee hours, making intentional noises. One time, one of them, a skinny guy with dyed neon green hair and bloodshot eyes, stopped me in the hallway and asked with a disturbing smile, "How long exactly do you plan on staying here?" His tone was so sinister, so threatening in its subtlety, that I locked my bedroom door with the extra lock that night for the first time in my entire life living in that house. And the next night, and every night after that without fail, I started sleeping very poorly. When I could sleep, I had my phone under my pillow, with the number 911 already typed on the screen. My finger millimeters away from pressing the power button at any sign of danger. I bought a much stronger additional lock for my bedroom door online and installed it myself with a drill. I started leaving a plastic cup filled with coins balanced on the inside doorknob. An old trick I learned on a TV show about home security years ago. If someone tried to open the door silently while I slept, vulnerable, the coins would fall with a clatter and wake me immediately. It sounds like extreme paranoia when you read it like that, when I describe it like that. But when you live in real and constant fear, when you physically feel that your life is in imminent danger, these precautions seem absolutely basic and essential for mere survival. It's no exaggeration. It's self-preservation instinct at work. I tried to talk to some friends at church about what was happening, but how do you explain something so absurd? My son wants me to die. My own son is poisoning me. It sounds so utterly absurd and implausible when you say those words out loud to someone else. People don't want to believe this kind of thing happens in real, normal, middle-class families. They tried to console me with cliches, saying it was just a difficult adjustment phase, that young adults sometimes temporarily resent their parents when life doesn't go as planned. Claire, you'll see, he'll get over it. It's just the frustration of getting older. But they didn't see what I saw every day. They didn't feel what I felt alone in that house. That horrible feeling of being actively hunted, persecuted, in your own home, in the place that should be your safest refuge, is something you simply never forget. It's a constant weight on your chest, an exhausting hypervigilance that leaves you exhausted but completely incapable of relaxing, or letting your guard down for a second. Susan, my best friend of decades, was the only one who took my concerns completely seriously from the very beginning. Perhaps because she'd known me for so long, she knew when I was exaggerating and when I was being genuinely honest. Claire, you need to get out of this house immediately, she told me firmly one afternoon when we met discreetly at a cafe in Beaverton, far from any place Thomas might appear. Come live with me for an indefinite period. I have a spare room. We'll figure this out together. I almost accepted the offer at that moment. God knows I desperately wanted to, but something deep and stubborn inside me categorically refused to be thrown out of my own home. It was my home, for God's sake. Mine and Robert's. We'd bought it together over 20 years ago. We'd painted every room with our own hands. We'd chosen every detail of the decor. We'd planted the rose bushes that now bloomed beautifully in the garden every summer. Why on earth should I be the one to leave, to lose everything, to give up my life? It didn't make sense. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. And then that day came. That damned day that changed absolutely everything forever. It was a gray Saturday morning, and it had been raining heavily all night without stopping. In that typical Portland way that outsiders don't understand, that persistent drizzle that seems never-ending. I was methodically cleaning the living room, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy and routine in my increasingly chaotic and frightening life, when Thomas came lumbering down the stairs. He had that look I'd painfully learned to recognize over the past few weeks, that specific look that clearly said he was about to say something deliberately cruel, just to hurt me. He took pleasure in it now. I could clearly see genuine pleasure in hurting me with sharp words, in seeing the physical and emotional impact they had on my face. It was like a sick game to him. Do you know what I was thinking this morning, Mom? He leaned casually against the doorframe of the living room, arms crossed, looking at me with that half-smile that held no hint of joy. I didn't respond, just continued wiping the wooden coffee table with the damp cloth, trying to ignore him completely, silently praying he'd just go back upstairs to his dark room and leave me alone. But he didn't leave. He stood there, watching me work, studying me, waiting for me to take the bait he was offering. The silence stretched uncomfortably, heavy and threatening like storm clouds. I was thinking about my upcoming birthday, about what I really want for a gift this year. My stomach instantly churned. Something in his voice, the specific tone he used, told me with absolute certainty that I didn't want to hear what came next. But I couldn't just run from the room like a coward. So I stood there, completely still, except for my hands that trembled slightly, waiting for the verbal blow that I knew for sure was coming. That was inevitable. The best gift would be for you to die, Mum. The words fell from his mouth so casually, so naturally, as if he were commenting on the weather forecast, or suggesting pizza for dinner. My entire body froze completely. Every muscle locked. The cloth fell from my hand limply. I heard the soft sound of it hitting the wooden floor, a sound that somehow echoed like a deafening thunderclap in my ears. I turned in slow motion to look directly at him, desperately searching for some sign that it was a horrible, tasteless joke, that he hadn't actually meant it seriously, that there would be a joke coming next to break the tension. But his face was completely serious. There was even a small half-smile tugging at the corners of his lips, a real smile. He was genuinely enjoying feeding on, savoring my visible pain. He was enjoying watching my reaction of shock and horror. Thomas, my voice came out as a hoarse, weak whisper, barely recognizable as my own. How could you say something like that to your own mother? He shrugged. That completely nonchalant shrug people make when they comment on the ridiculous price of gas or the bad traffic. So casual, so normal, so frighteningly common, as if he'd just suggested pizza for dinner instead of explicitly articulating an active desire for his own mother's death. It's simply the objective truth. There's no point in pretending between us anymore. We both know perfectly well that your life no longer has any real purpose. You're just a retired teacher living on a state pension and Social Security. I, on the other hand, have a whole life ahead of me, full of potential. It makes more logical sense for you to step aside and let me finally live the life I deserve. Each word was like a bullet piercing through the decades and decades of unconditional love I had invested in him. How do you respond to something like that? How do you react emotionally when the person you loved more than anything in the entire world, whom you carried within your own body for 9 long months, whom you watched take their first staggering steps, speak their first words, whom you cared for through every illness, whom you consoled through every sorrow, explicitly tells you that it would be better, preferable, if you simply no longer existed? There is no manual for this. There is no emotional or psychological protocol that prepares you in the slightest to hear your child, your only child, express the active, articulate desire for your death. I could have collapsed right there in the middle of the room. I could have fallen to my knees, crying hysterically, begging, asking where exactly I had gone so terribly wrong. I could have tried desperately to hug him, to awaken something human within him, to appeal to the helpless baby who had once been in my arms, but something fundamental and deep within me shifted at that precise moment. A cold, crystal-clear clarity washed over me, as if a switch had been flicked in my brain, going into survival mode. It was almost an out-of-body experience, as if I could see myself from the outside and see the entire situation with clinical detachment. I realized, with absolute, crystal-clear, painful certainty, that the Thomas I knew and loved, my real son, had died long ago. Maybe at Robert's funeral, maybe even before that. Gradually, it no longer mattered when exactly it happened. What mattered, the only thing that truly mattered now, was that the physical person standing there in front of me was a dangerous stranger, and I urgently needed to protect myself or I would die. I understand perfectly. That was all I said. 2 simple words. Direct, without visible emotion. I saw genuine surprise flash across his face. He expected dramatic shock, abundant tears, desperate pleas, emotional drama, but I wasn't going to give him that final satisfaction. I picked up the cloth from the floor with hands that trembled only slightly, put it back in the bucket of water, and calmly climbed the stairs to my room. Each step felt like it weighed literally tons. I locked the door behind me, the regular lock and the extra one too, sat on the edge of the bed, and for the first time in long months of pent-up tension, I finally let the tears fall freely. I didn't cry out loud. I absolutely didn't want him to hear and revel in my suffering, but I cried silently. I cried for the son I had lost forever, for the wonderful marriage that ended too soon and tragically, for the life I had naively imagined I would have and that never even remotely came to fruition. I cried until I literally had no tears left, until my eyes were swollen and sore and my throat was raw. And then, when there was nothing left inside me but a cold emptiness, I finally began to plan my survival. You think you know someone completely, especially when it's your own biological child. You've personally witnessed every major milestone in their development. You know exactly how they sleep, how they eat, what specific face they make when they lie, or when they're genuinely happy, or when they're scared. But the harsh, inescapable truth is that people can gradually transform into things we never in a million years imagined. Resentment, when left to grow unchecked and untreated, can systematically poison even the purest and most loving hearts. Like a silent, invisible disease, it slowly kills the good parts, cell by cell, until only complete darkness remains. And Thomas had knowingly let resentment completely take over every part of him. He no longer saw a mother when he looked at me. He saw only an inconvenient financial obstacle, an item on a to-do list that urgently needed to be crossed off, an inconvenience that was delaying and preventing him from living the life he felt he deserved. That terrible night, when when Thomas went out with those weird friends, probably to drink and celebrate how deeply he'd hurt me with his cruel words, I did something I never in my life thought I would do. I violated his privacy. I entered his room without permission. My heart was beating so wildly hard and fast that I genuinely thought I would pass out right there. Cold sweat dripped down my back despite the air conditioning in the freezing house, but I desperately needed to know the full truth. I needed to confirm once and for all whether my worst fears were real and well-founded, or if it was all just paranoia in my head, my mind trying to make sense of cruel words but potentially without any real threat behind them. His laptop was open on his cluttered desk. I knew his password. He hadn't bothered to change it since high school. It was still Mariners 2015, the glorious year his baseball team won the state championship and he was named MVP, a nostalgic and innocent detail that now seemed terribly ironic and sad. My hands trembled visibly as I typed in the familiar password. The screen lit up brightly, that distinctive blue light illuminating my tense face in the pitch-black room. What I'd found investigating that laptop had left me reeling in a way that not even his horrific words had, because cruel words can theoretically be taken back, explained away later, recontextualized, attributed to momentary anger. But what I saw meticulously documented there was concrete proof, physical evidence, clear demonstration of calculated premeditation. There were dozens of organized files, so many files meticulously organized into digital folders with eerily casual names like research, timeline, finances, post, legal steps, extensive research on specific poisons undetectable in standard autopsies, obscure dark web forums on how to create convincing household accidents, fatal falls downstairs, deadly gas leaks, accidental medication overdoses that would appear natural, detailed conversations on encrypted messaging apps with anonymous people I didn't know, openly discussing how to accelerate an inheritance with the eerie casualness of someone discussing cake recipes or the weather forecast. There was even an extremely detailed document, a sort of step-by-step plan, professionally formatted, like a corporate PowerPoint presentation. My full name was at the top in bold. Claire's Plan was the main title, in Arial black font. Size 24, centered, like a school project, as if my death were just another work assignment to be completed efficiently within the deadline. I felt bitter bile rise violently in my throat. I literally had to cover my mouth with both hands to keep from vomiting right there on his bedroom carpet. The absolutely terrifying level of detail was something out of a thriller. He had absolutely everything calculated precisely, how long each method would take, how to make it look like natural or accidental death, where exactly he would be when it happened to have a solid, unquestionable alibi. He had even casually mentioned to several different people, creating multiple witnesses, that he planned to visit an old college friend in Seattle on that specific weekend marked on his digital calendar, 3 weeks in advance, creating a proven geographic distance from any crime. He had obsessively researched my complete daily routine, my fixed schedules, when exactly I took each medication, when I went to the doctor, when I was alone at home, vulnerable. There were pages and pages of notes about real conversations we had, but completely distorted and rewritten to make me appear senile, confused, mentally unstable, dangerous to myself. He was meticulously documenting everything, carefully constructing a complete alternative narrative where he would be seen as the devoted and concerned son who sadly and tragically lost his elderly mother, who was visibly losing her mind and mental capacity. One particular part made me literally stop breathing for a long moment. It was a conversation between him and someone identified only as Jake_PDX on a hidden dark web forum I hadn't even known existed before. Jake was giving detailed, technical advice on how to induce a fatal fall down old wooden stairs like the ones in our house, the exact angle needed, the perfect time of day, how to ensure it was definitely lethal but would appear completely accidental to any cursory investigation. Thomas had responded enthusiastically, "It's absolutely perfect. She's 52, has a recent history of frequent self-inflicted giddiness. Haha, no one will suspect a thing. I'll finally inherit the entire house and live the life I always deserved." Seriously considering expediting the process, I honestly can't wait any longer. The disturbing lightness with which he casually spoke about my violent death, the remorseless typed laugh, the multiple money emojis he'd gleefully added at the end of the message, it was frightening in a way that goes far beyond any words I know. This was definitely not my son anymore. He was a complete sociopath with no conscience. I continued reading compulsively, completely unable to stop, despite the growing horror that suffocated me. There was a complex Excel spreadsheet meticulously detailing his future finances, exactly how much the house was worth according to 3 different real estate appraisal websites. The average calculated how much the state's inheritance tax would be in Oregon, how much would be left after all legal fees and taxes. There were even colorful projections of future investments, pie charts showing what he would specifically do with every penny of my death proceeds. Invest $200,000 in various crypto, $150,000 in a promising tech startup, spend $100,000 on extensive international travel, and pay off all credit card debt. My entire life, my violent death, coldly reduced to colorful numbers in an Excel spreadsheet. I took photos of absolutely everything with my phone. My hands were shaking so violently that many came out blurry and out of focus. I had to take a deep breath and retake them several times. Concrete evidence, physical proof. I didn't yet know exactly what I was going to do with them, what my next step would be, but I needed complete documentation. I methodically photographed every file, every incriminating conversation, every microscopic piece of evidence of his calculated evil. Then I carefully closed everything, cleared my browsing history so he wouldn't find out someone had been tampering with it, set the laptop back at exactly the precise angle it had been at before, and quietly returned to my room. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the hundreds of photos on my phone, scrolling through them one by one slowly, trying to process the absolutely terrifying magnitude of the real and imminent danger I was in. My own son was actively, meticulously, patiently planning to murder me. It wasn't paranoid exaggeration. It wasn't misreading ambiguous signals. It was real, concrete, documented in horrific detail. It even had a specific date set, exactly 3 weeks from now. According to his detailed timeline with milestones and deadlines. I spent that entire night awake, completely unable to sleep, obsessively thinking about my limited options. Every possible scenario my exhausted mind concocted had massive flaws, dire risks, and potentially fatal consequences. I could go straight to the police tomorrow morning, but realistically, what would they do? He hadn't technically done anything illegal yet, just meticulously researched and planned. Thoughts and plans, no matter how horrific and detailed, aren't technically punishable crimes. Would that be enough for a temporary restraining order? For pretrial detention? I sincerely doubted it. I'd watched enough episodes of Law and Order to know that thoughts, fantasies, even detailed plans, aren't crimes until they're turned into concrete actions. I could try to legally evict him from my home through the courts, but that would take precious time in Oregon, at least 30 full days of legal proceedings, maybe 60 or more if he formally contested Eton during that dangerous time. I would be even more vulnerable, living under the same roof with someone who knew I was actively trying to evict him. He could easily drastically accelerate his plan, act before he was forced to leave. He could simply run away like a coward, abandon everything, and start over in another distant state. But why the hell should I be the one to lose everything? My home, my life, my entire community, my friends, my church, because of his wickedness and greed. It didn't make any sense. It wasn't even slightly fair. It wasn't right at all. When the sun finally began to rise slowly, casting that dim, diffuse, grayish light so typical of Portland through the heavy curtains, that morning light that always made me think hopefully of new beginnings and second chances, I had finally made a firm and irreversible decision. I absolutely would not be the passive victim of this terrible story. I would not allow my son to turn me into just another sad statistic, another footnote about a tragic fall down the stairs or an unfortunate household gas accident. I was going to turn the tables completely, but I needed to be extremely clever and careful. I needed a plan as good as his, as detailed and even better, in fact, because unlike him, I had several important things he didn't: the valuable experience of decades of life, the practical wisdom of someone who had already survived and overcome far more than he could have imagined in his youth, and most crucially, the total element of surprise. He naively thought I was just an older woman, fragile, naive, passive, waiting resignedly for whatever would come. He was completely and dangerously wrong. The first strategic thing I did was discreetly call my best friend, Susan. We'd known each other intimately since our distant college days at the University of Oregon. Over 30 long years of solid friendship. We'd been inseparable roommates, bridesmaids, and wedding witnesses for each other, and we'd cried together inconsolably when Robert tragically died. If there was anyone in the entire world I could trust absolutely and completely, it was her without a doubt. I arranged an urgent meeting at a cafe just outside of Portland, at a discreet Starbucks in Beaverton. Far from anywhere Thomas might casually see us, or where we might be recognized by anyone we knew in common. When I quietly told Susan absolutely everything, showing her the hundreds of incriminating photos on my shaking phone, she literally went white. All color drained instantly from her face. "Claire," she whispered intensely, her hand shaking visibly as she gripped mine tightly across the table. "You need to go to the police immediately. Right now, today. This is clearly documented, premeditated, attempted murder." But I firmly shook my head. "I'd been thinking and rethinking this all night long. It's not legally sufficient, Sue. Trust me, he's very smart, very careful. He'll categorically deny everything, convincingly claiming it was just morbid internet curiosity, that the conversations were a bad joke between friends, a fantasy without real intent, a fictional role, as he himself mentions in some places." And then what happens? In the best-case scenario, he temporarily becomes even more resentful, more dangerous, more motivated, and I continue to live vulnerable with him while the slow legal system processes everything bureaucratically for months, or even worse, much worse. They simply don't do anything concrete because he hasn't technically committed a crime yet, under the law. He just thought and planned, and I prematurely showed all my cards. He'll know for sure that I know everything, and he'll immediately accelerate and execute everything before I can adequately protect myself. Susan held both my hands tightly across the table, her clear eyes filled with genuine tears of concern. "So what exactly are you going to do, Claire? Tell me. I can't lose you too. We've already lost Robert tragically. I can't lose you the same way." Her voice cracked emotionally at the end. I took a deep, long breath, the deep, determined breath of someone about to jump off a towering cliff, unsure of a safety net. "I'm going to make him reveal himself completely. I'm going to create and manipulate a specific situation where he'll be forced to try something concrete and blatant, where he'll have to act and expose himself, and then I'll finally have real, undeniable evidence that even the most skeptical police won't be able to ignore or dismiss. And through all this, I'm going to protect myself in absolutely every way I can think of." Susan looked at me with a mixed expression of admiration and terror, her eyes wide. "Are you seriously proposing to use yourself as human bait? Claire, this is complete, suicidal madness. What if it goes wrong? What if he actually manages to kill you before anyone intervenes? Maybe it really was dangerous madness. It probably was. But honestly, what other real choice did I have at that moment? Sit passively and expectantly, simply waiting patiently for my son to kill me according to his schedule, run like a coward and live the rest of my life constantly looking nervously over my shoulder? No, definitely not. It wasn't who I was at my core. It wasn't how I'd lived my entire life up until now. I'd always faced problems and challenges head-on, directly, not run away from them with my tail between my legs. And I wasn't going to start running now, no matter how terrifying the situation. Fear wouldn't paralyze me. It would motivate me to act intelligently. We devised a detailed plan together in that quiet cafe. Over long hours that seemed to simultaneously fly by and drag on forever. Susan would stay in constant, close contact with me, without fail. I would send her short-code messages strictly every 3 hours. A clear day today meant everything was relatively safe and well. Heavy rain meant imminent danger, a real emergency. If she didn't receive a message promptly at the agreed time, I would call the police immediately without hesitation, without giving her the benefit of the doubt. I secretly installed hidden security cameras in several strategic rooms of the house. Small and discreet ones that looked like ordinary decor or normal electronics. One camouflaged in the living room wall clock, another embedded in a fake smoke detector, a third hidden in a seemingly ordinary cell phone charger in the kitchen, all recording continuously with automatic cloud backup. I began religiously wearing one of those Apple Watch smartwatches that constantly monitor heart rate and can automatically call emergency services if they detect a sudden fall, strong impact, or sudden cardiac arrest. I immediately changed all my bank and online account passwords, rigorously updated all security logins, and enabled mandatory two-factor authentication on absolutely everything. I made a completely new will with a different, unknown lawyer, one Thomas didn't know or even knew existed, explicitly leaving the entire house to Grace Community Church if anything happened to me under suspicious, questionable, or unnatural circumstances. I included a very specific legal clause, clearly stating that Thomas would not receive a single cent if there was even the slightest suspicion of direct or indirect involvement in my death. Essentially, I completely removed any financial benefit Thomas would have derived from my death. If he killed me now, he would gain absolutely nothing. He would only lose everything. And so, finally armed with multiple safeguards and a solid backup plan, I began deliberately provoking him strategically, subtly at first, testing the waters. I casually mentioned during a tense dinner when I'd carefully prepared myself, not him, and which I only ate after watching him first eat generously from the same pan that I'd recently updated my will with my lawyer. I saw his eyes visibly widen, that unmistakable flash of panic he desperately tried to hide but couldn't completely. "Why did you do this now?" He tried to sound casual and disinterested, but the obvious tension in his voice was impossible to disguise. I could clearly see his jaw tighten involuntarily, the veins in his neck bulge and throb. "Oh, you know how it is, son. We get older, more aware of mortality. We need to have the important things in order legally." I left everything to Grace Community Church. Pastor Morrison was so touched and grateful when I told him they'll make wonderful use of the property, turning it into a large community center or perhaps a permanent homeless shelter, something that will truly help and positively impact the entire community. His face turned bright red with suppressed anger, that deep, vivid red he used to see when he was a small child throwing a tantrum. "You can't legally do that," he said sharply, no longer even trying to hide his boiling anger. "I'm your son, your only living family. I have a legal right to the family inheritance." I gave a deliberately casual shrug. "Actually, I can do exactly what I want with my property. I consulted an experienced lawyer. Everything is perfectly legal and documented, and I honestly think it's the best possible use of my assets. You're young. You have your whole life ahead of you. You'll build your own wealth by working. The church needs it so much more." He stood abruptly from the table, his chair nearly tipping backward with the force. "This is unfair, and you know it. After everything I've endured." That was our first major direct confrontation after his plan was revealed. The following weeks were the most tense and terrifying of my entire life. Thomas oscillated violently between explosive fury and icy, calculating silence. He stopped talking to me completely for days at a time. When he did speak, it was only to make cutting comments about how tired, frail, and sick I looked. "You don't look well, Mom. Maybe you should go see a doctor and get that dizziness checked out." I could palpably feel his frustration growing exponentially. His meticulous plan had been completely ruined by the change in his will. Now killing me would bring no benefit whatsoever. But the anger, the deep resentment, the hatred, all of it remained and grew like a malignant tumor. Then he began to become visibly desperate and irrational, and desperate people do extremely stupid things without thinking of the consequences. One particular night, I was taking a hot shower, trying to relax the constant tension in my shoulders, when I distinctly heard the bathroom door slowly open. My heart immediately raced in panic. I was absolutely certain I had locked it carefully. Through the plastic shower curtain, I saw a human shadow. Thomas. He was simply standing there in the doorway, just staring, motionless. "Mom, do you have any extra shampoo stored?" His voice was strange, forced, to artificial. "In the cabinet under the sink," I answered, struggling to keep my voice steady and controlled, despite the absolute terror I felt. He stood there for another long, eternity-inducing moment, and then finally left. When I finished showering quickly, shivering uncontrollably from both cold and fear, I carefully checked the door. The lock had been recently forced, fresh marks on the wood. He had literally broken in. That completely lame excuse about shampoo. It was obvious to anyone he was assessing an opportunity to attack. Bathrooms are statistically where fatal accidents occur most frequently. Falls, drownings, electrocution, if something electronic strategically falls into the water. My son had broken in and forced open the bathroom door while I was completely vulnerable, naked, defenseless, wet, to assess and see if he could do anything there. I sent a coded message to Susan absolutely immediately as soon as I left the bathroom. "He just forced open the bathroom door while I was showering. Things are escalating dangerously fast." She responded within seconds. "Get out of there immediately, Claire. Come to my house now. Now." but I stubbornly couldn't yet. I still didn't have enough concrete evidence, only suspicions, and break-in. So I stayed, but I slept with a heavy chair firmly propped against the bedroom door that entire night. And every night after that, without exception, that his next move was even bolder and more obviously dangerous. I came home one afternoon after doing my weekly grocery shopping at Safeway, and there was a strong, unmistakable chemical smell throughout the house, like gas, natural. My first instinct was to run frantically to the kitchen. The stove was on all burners, but completely without fire, just pure gas billowing and spreading. The windows were all strategically closed and locked. If I hadn't arrived exactly when I did, if I'd stayed in the grocery store for just another hour, exploring as I sometimes naturally did, I would have returned to a house completely saturated with flammable gas. A single random spark, a light switch being flipped, and boom, massive explosion. Goodbye, Claire. Sounds like a tragic domestic accident. I quickly turned off all the gas, flung open all the windows and doors, and immediately left the house for complete safety. I called the gas company in a trembling voice to report a dangerous leak. They came quickly, meticulously checked everything, and found absolutely nothing wrong with any of the equipment. It looks like someone just manually turned on the stove without lighting it. Ma'am, the technician said to me, looking confused. Do you live alone here? I looked directly at Thomas, who had conveniently arrived home just at that exact moment, with a perfectly practiced expression of mock extreme concern on his face. No, I live with my adult son. The technician nodded politely to Thomas. Well, maybe you two should be a lot more careful from now on. This is extremely dangerous, and potentially fatal. That night, Thomas came to me with an angelic expression. Mom, you really have to be much more careful with these things. You could have blown up the whole house and killed us both. You've been getting dangerously forgetful lately. I think you need to see a neurologist, get cognitive tests. He was planting and reinforcing his narrative publicly, making it appear outwardly that I was the senile, confused person, dangerous to myself and others. I looked him straight in the eye. I didn't turn on that stove, Thomas, and we both know it perfectly well. He blinked several times, genuinely surprised by my bluntness. What are you talking about? Who else could it have been? I didn't respond. I just turned and silently walked to my locked room. But that had definitely gone dangerously far. He had definitely tried to blow me up. This was a clear attempt at murder, no matter how he tried to disguise or justify it. The next morning, I methodically gathered all my carefully collected evidence, the hundreds of photos from his laptop, all the documented messages he'd sent to Susan, the hidden camera videos including one where you could clearly see him breaking into the bathroom while I was vulnerable there, and another especially incriminating one where he deliberately tampered with the stove before leaving the house. That particular morning and was assigned directly to Portland Police Central Station. The detective who attentively attended to me was a serious, middle-aged black man named Marcus Johnson. He listened patiently for over an hour, examining all the physical evidence with increasing attention. And I clearly saw his facial expression gradually change from naturally skeptical to profoundly shocked. Ms. Richards, this is extremely serious, possibly one of the most elaborate cases I've ever seen. I'm going to need you to make a full and detailed formal statement, and will need to bring your son in immediately for extensive questioning. I nodded. Do absolutely whatever is necessary, detective. I just want to finally be genuinely safe in my own home. He held my gaze seriously. You will be safe. I personally promised that. They came to pick up Thomas that same afternoon. I was strategically not home. Susan had firmly insisted I stay with her while everything dangerously unfolded. But as Detective Johnson later recounted to me in detail, Thomas had vehemently denied everything at the beginning of the interrogation. He convincingly claimed the computer searches were for a creative fiction writing project he was developing, that the specific online conversations were just fictional role-play between bored friends, that the stove incident had genuinely been an accident on my part, demonstrating cognitive decline. He was extremely convincing when he wanted to be. He had always been good with persuasive words and manipulation. But then they showed him the irrefutable videos, the video of him deliberately forcing open the bathroom door, the incriminating video of him intentionally tampering with the stove, and the expression on his face, as the detective vividly described, was one of pure animal panic. Because it's one thing to deny spoken words, it's quite another to deny HD video clearly showing his actions. He desperately tried to say he was just worried about me, that he wanted to check if I was actually okay in the shower. But when confronted directly with the extremely detailed planning on the laptop, with the explicit conversations about inheritance and causing strategic accidents, his entire elaborate story completely collapsed like a house of cards. Thomas was formally arrested that night, charged with attempted first-degree murder, aggravated stalking, and several other serious crimes I didn't even know existed. Bail was set too high, absurdly high, for him to pay on his own. He called me frantically from the prison payphone. It was the most surreal and emotionally complex call of my entire life. "Mom, please, listen. You can't really do this to me. I wasn't actually going to do anything. It was just fantasy, bad thoughts that everyone has. Normal people have bad thoughts sometimes, and don't act on them." His voice was pure, desperate, pleading. Part of me, that deep part that was still an unconditional mother, that still vividly remembered the helpless baby he had been, desperately wanted to believe. I wanted to pay the high bail, bring my son home, pretend absolutely none of this had happened, and return to some semblance of normalcy. But I simply couldn't do that, not after absolutely everything that had happened. "Thomas," I said, my voice surprisingly firmer than I'd hoped, "you explicitly told me that the greatest gift would be for me to die, and then you methodically tried to make that happen in multiple ways. These weren't just abstract thoughts. These were concrete, deliberate actions, and actions always have inevitable consequences." And I hung up the phone for good. The formal trial took many months to finally take place. During this difficult time, I had to emotionally process everything. I underwent intensive therapy, something I honestly should have done years ago. My excellent therapist, Dr. Linda Martinez, helped me deeply understand and accept that it wasn't my fault at all, that I hadn't created a monster through my failings as a mother, that people make individual choices, and Thomas had consciously made bad ones, one after another, systematically, until he reached a point of no return. "You were a good, dedicated mother, Claire," she told me repeatedly in one particularly emotional session. "Sometimes, due to complex factors far beyond our direct control, genetics, unprocessed trauma, negative external influences, brain chemistry, people become something we never expected or imagined. This is absolutely no reflection on your worth or competence as a mother, but it still hurt deeply." Good heavens, how it hurt deeply. Because at the end of it all, he was still technically my son, my only son. I still remembered perfectly when he was just 5 years old and proudly brought home a little yellow flower he'd picked on the way home from school, just to give it to me and see me smile. I remembered him crying inconsolably in my arms when the family's beloved dog died of old age. I remembered so many genuinely good moments that now seemed to belong to a completely different life, to fundamentally different people. How do you reconcile these two contradictory versions of the same person? The public trial was a veritable sensationalist media circus. Son meticulously planning to kill mother for inheritance was exactly the kind of sordid headline that sells newspapers and generates clicks. Aggressive reporters persistently camped outside my house. I had to give interviews I definitely didn't want to give. I had to relive the entire trauma publicly in front of cameras, but I also received completely unexpected and comforting support. Hundreds of moving letters from people across the country who had been through similar situations, families irreparably broken by greed, by toxic resentment, by untreated mental illness. I wasn't alone in this. I gradually discovered this didn't necessarily make it easier emotionally, but it helped to know I wasn't a unique case. Have you ever experienced a family betrayal that seemed completely impossible to overcome? How did you cope with the pain? Leave your story in the comments, because sharing our experiences is how we truly heal together. And if this story touched you in any way, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell, because here we courageously talk about the real and difficult things, the things no one else wants to discuss openly. And you deserve a space where your pain is genuinely validated and your strength is celebrated.